I'm Kraske Kemper, the director of the Kansas City Public Library, and last night here in the library we did a program on Kansas City noir and film noir with Mitch Bryan, and I said to everyone last night, I said, if you think things are dark in the Kansas City crime, come tomorrow night and we'll do city financial planning. So I assume some of you have come from last night's crime presentation. But you know, Benjamin Franklin said there's nothing certain but death and taxes. So tonight we thought we'd combine the two with a program on death by taxes. Sorry, I've now told you what my point of view, should I be on the panel, would be about our financial future. But what I do really want to tell you, we're honored to be hosting the Citizens Association in this first of a series of programs. This is an idea of Jonathan Kemper's, who is a member of the Citizens Association, and Dan Coffrin, whom I will turn this over to in a minute, who's the chair of the Citizens Association. It's something the library has needed to do for a while and wanted to do for a while, which is to host a series of forums on important city issues, and to go beyond that to present information. There's some information that we worked on, that Dan prepared, but a number of us worked on over the last few weeks. There are the five-year long-term financial plan is here, but we'll set up a website in the library for discussion of these issues. And for more information to come to you from many sources. This is the kind of thing that libraries should do. It's the kind of thing we absolutely need for citizens to do. As I was looking at some other cities that we sometimes compare ourselves to, I noted that many of them have long ongoing discussions, interactive discussions with the citizenry online, have websites where you can interactively play with the city budget yourself. We need to, yeah, I know exactly the way they've been playing. Sorry, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there. We need more citizen engagement in what we're doing in this city. We absolutely need more citizen engagement, and you have my commitment from the library's point of view to be a venue for that, to provide information for that, to help you become more involved, more engaged, and more informed. And now I will turn it over to the chair of the Citizens Association, who has made all this possible and for whom we are very grateful, Dan Coffrin.
Thank you, Crosby. We've been very pleased the last few months to sit down with people from the Kansas City Library to talk about putting together a series of programs like this. We both realized that both the library and the Citizens Association, as the city's oldest nonpartisan political organization, share a mission to provide a forum for the exercise of municipal citizenship, if you will. And maybe that's not happened as much recently as it had in the past, and we want to reinvigorate that process. So we're presenting these quarterly programs this year with a view to educating and actually engaging the public, you all, more in your city government, and holding our government accountable for the good policies and the good future that we all deserve. So we're very pleased with this very fine turnout tonight at our first of the four forums. You have probably received word elsewhere that our next forum will be April 4 about local control of the police department. That's going to be a very big issue this year. In the summer, on July 11, we'll have a program about replacement of the terminals at KCI. And then in October, a program on the Missouri and Kansas economic development tax incentive border wars, where the two states are competing with each other to move jobs just a few miles with no net benefit to the metropolitan area. These are the four topics we picked. We think that you all will find interesting, and by the look of tonight's turnout, something that most people don't get excited about, finances. Jan and I were talking about this earlier. We looked like we got more finance nerds than we thought, but it'll be a good time. We're very pleased we have a number of our elected officials with the city here this evening. If you folks would stand up when I call your name. Scott Wagner, you're here, 1st District. There's Mr. Wagner. John Sharp, 6th District. Dick Davis, where's Mr. Davis, 1st District? There he is. Jan Marcus, and of course, you'll be hearing more from her. She's on our panel. And Councilman Glover, the 4th District. Where is Jim? There he is right there. I hope I have not missed anyone else who walked in just a few moments ago. The Citizens Association in the past has been very active every 4 years in our city elections for mayor and city council. And we are looking forward now to being more active in non-election years. So one of the things we're doing are these forums. So we're very pleased with the turnout. Tonight, we're going to talk about finances, as I said, specifically long-range financial planning for our city. Most of us as individuals do our own personal financial planning. How are you going to pay for your kids' college? How are you going to pay for a major addition to your home, for example, that you have to do on a multi-year basis? Shouldn't cities do the same? And we're going to talk about that tonight. We have a great moderator this evening. I'd like to welcome to the podium Mr. Steve Kraske. I'm sure most of you know Steve with the Kansas City Star and also the host of the KCUR program, Up to Date. Mr. Kraske is going to take us through this really exciting topic tonight. Isn't that right, Steve? And one last thing, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce 2 of our board members, Joanne Collins, former council person, and Alan Dillingham, a Parks and Board Recreation Commissioner, who are the co-chairs for this event and did all the behind-the-scenes work putting it together. So thank you 2 very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Have at it.
Appreciate it. Good evening.
Good evening.
Now, what is it about forums like this where we have a packed house, but yet the best seats in the house are right here in front and they're empty? We're adding seats in the back. We have open seats up here in front. If anyone wants to have a seat up front, please come and sit down. Well, as Dan just mentioned, tonight's forum is about long-term financial planning. The challenges facing our city are profound, and many of you already know that. You're going to hear a lot tonight about just how challenging the issues are that face Kansas City in the years to come. A word of context very quickly, Kansas City is regarded by many as a very well-run town, especially when you compare us to our sister cities not too far away. But when it comes to debt and an overall tax burden that places Kansas City in the rear when it comes to tax burden, cities like Denver, Oklahoma City, Omaha, Minneapolis, and Milwaukee all have lighter tax burdens than Kansas City, Missouri. It's obviously clear that some serious challenges remain. And when we talk about money, I'm reminded about a night in College Station, Texas in 1995. I was covering the presidential race that year, and I went down to Texas to cover the entrance into the race of Phil Gramm, who was the first candidate to enter the race for president that year. And he had a fundraiser, which was the biggest fundraiser at that point in the history of American presidential campaigning, $4.5 million, lots of cowboy hats, lots of Stensons, lots of cowboy boots. And it was a beautiful event that evening with all these folks in a big convention hall in Texas. And Phil Gramm stunned the journalistic establishment that night when he stood up in front of the crowd. He looked at everybody and he said, "I want y'all to know that I've got the best friend you can have in American politics, and that's ready money." And all the journalists were scrambling. What did he say? Did he really say that? What was that? Well, ready money. That's our topic tonight. And does Kansas City have enough ready money going forward? How's that for a transition? Thank you. Yes, thank you. A couple more stats that might set the table for us tonight. In the last 10 years, the city's population has grown by 4%, but expenses are up by $130 million, or 58%. The city is carrying $560 million in unfunded pension obligations. Folks, that's more than $500 million. Then there's the question of debt. In 2003, it totaled about $500 million. Today, it's $1.6 billion, or $3,500 a resident. The comparison with other cities on this front is not very pretty. To coin another political expression from my career, $1 million here and $1 million there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. That's what we're talking about tonight. The Citizens Association has pulled together a terrific panel. Let me introduce you to them now. Troy Schulte is a city manager of Kansas City, Missouri. Troy. Alfred Ho is a professor in the School of Public Affairs and Administration at KU. Alfred. Jim Gagg is a CPA. He spent 38 years with PricewaterhouseCoopers, with most of those years in Kansas City. He's been engaged by the Civic Council to lead a review of the city's long-term financial plans. Jim, nice to have you. And Jan Markuson is a member of the Kansas City Council. She chairs the Finance Committee. Jan, good to have you too. Yeah, great. And I'm tempted to say, if you have a question for our audience, 816-235-28. But if you do have questions, we will have a place in our program later on for questions from you all. So please, you'll have a chance to go there as we move along here. Well, let's begin with this first question. You know, the city, as I've said, faces a whole lot of financial challenges, and there are lots of numbers that tell that story. But what I'm wondering is, for our panel members, what worries you the most when it comes to our city's future and its future finances? What keeps you up at night? Troy Schulte, you stay up at night worrying about this stuff. What worries you?
Well, I think our biggest issue is 43% of our general fund revenues are at risk every 5 years. So from a
Talking about the earnings tax.
From the earnings tax standpoint, it's a huge issue. It's the police department or every other service in city government. It is a big issue, half of which is paid for by non-residents of Kansas City, Missouri. So it's about a $220 million annual financial impact to the city. What always is worried is to make sure that the city's moving in the direction to make sure that it's providing the services that the residents want, because every 5 years they get a check and evaluate our performance. Now, that can be a good thing or a bad thing, so what we try to do is make sure it's a good thing every 5 years from a city staff standpoint. But that's one of the issues, is you've got a lot of risk, you've got a lot of uncertainty. It creates a lot of issues with the credit markets. Every time we go to borrow, they'll ask, well, what's your long-term plan in case you lose the earnings tax? And right now, as through this process, we've been saying, well, we're going to build some reserves. We're going to try to talk to the state legislature, but we need to do this financial planning to make sure that we can protect the city if something were to happen. I keep coming back, even our favorite transit gentleman from Virginia, West Virginia, got 1 passed out of 8. And the way that process is, there aren't any do-overs on those votes. So it's a big issue. It's definitely an accountability measure that the residents have on the city, but we have to be cognizant of there aren't many pleasant alternatives to the earnings tax. We don't have statutory authority for either higher sales taxes or significantly higher property taxes, so the impact on services is going to be dramatic. So that's what keeps me up at night. It ties into this issue. Used to be the water department. I'm sleeping a little better about the water department, but so we've just got to be diligent in our efforts to put a financial plan in place, make it readily accessible to our residents so they understand why we need the money we need, how we spend it, and hopefully get their long-term buy-in and commitment so that every 5 years they give us that positive check.
Councilwoman Markuson, why don't you go next? And I'm also wondering, do we need to change the law so that we aren't going before the voters every 5 years? Is that one of your agenda items going forward?
I don't know if that's a realistic agenda item, but that would be a good thing if we didn't have to do the earnings tax. And Crosby introduced, Crosby is sort of the glass half empty type of person, and I'm kind of the glass half full type of person. So I think what keeps me up at night, and I think that as an elected official, we really have a lot of important decisions to make about the financial stability of our city. And I think last council, with Deb Herman's leadership on the finance chair, and I was her vice chair, and now I've kind of carried out that same deliberative approach. But there is a tension because we want to protect the financial security, but we also have constituents who have an awful lot of things that are great ideas, that are expectations, and so that tension, and I think that if anything worries me, I think that we have done a lot of good ground laying over the last, at least I've been on the council almost 6 years. We have been very deliberate about policies that we've put in place. And that maybe in better times, the next council may not be as resolute. And things can, we have term limits, so you get a whole new group of people every 4 years. And in good times, sometimes there is a feeding frenzy. And there are a lot of things that people want in the city. And I think that we need to do a very good job of giving people the assurance that we've set a sound financial base. We have sound policies in place. We need to make sure those are institutionalized. So it makes it easier on elected officials. We want to be able to respond to opportunities because, if we couldn't find money for the Major League Baseball, the All-Star game, that would have been a really missed opportunity. So we want to keep our budget, really tight, but be able to be flexible enough to do some exciting things or things that'll move our city forward. So I feel confident. So I don't stay up at night worrying about what's going on right now, but maybe
Crosby does.
to make sure. He does, but that's,
Jim Gagg, what keeps you up at night as you look at our city and its finances?
Well, Steve, I think you've already mentioned two of them, and those are really the long-term obligations. And they're I think that's been well chronicled and well known, the city's debt load, which increased dramatically in the last 7 to 8 years, as well as the pension obligations. So I think the city has to have a prudent plan to do that, to manage those pension obligations. There is a pension reform effort underway, and continuing that and bringing that to fruition is very important. And the city has done, I think, a good job of managing its debt. It's just that we're seeing at a local level kind of what's happening on a bigger stage in Washington. The debt is becoming a real obstacle. And where it comes into play as we go off into the future, these two areas of expenditure, debt service to repay the debt, the $1.6 billion that's already been borrowed, and to fund these pensions, to get them fully funded, it's going to take a bigger and bigger piece of the city's expenditure budget. And what that's going to mean is there's less money to spend for the services that the citizens want. There's going to be less money to make investments, and this is probably, in my mind, the most important one. The city needs to be very strategic in how it spends its resources and make investments that are going to drive economic growth. That's how we get a more robust tax base. That's how we generate more tax revenue for the city. That's how we have more disposable income for our citizens. And it's making those decisions. So if you're spending more and more of your money on debt service and on funding pensions, then you're just not going to have the resources and flexibility to make those investments. So I'm fearful of administrations in the future really being constrained. And certainly the present administration the new mayor and the council have inherited this, and they're having to deal with it. But that's what I see to be the real challenge.
It's amazing to me how much you sound like a member of Congress. I mean, it's a very similar situation there. Alfred Ho.
Well, I have to be honest that these things never keep me up at night. I always joke with my students that my budgeting class is very important, but never listen to me. So when they actually see that so many people are interested in the finance, I think they will change their mind, hopefully. I think the issue that we are talking about here is a real issue. I travel around the world, went to Australia 2 months ago. If you actually hear the news about Europe, it's the same issue, how to deal with fiscal sustainability issue. And I think what bothers me a little bit, to be honest, in a lot of this debate is citizens want more, but they don't want to pay for it. I think that's the fundamental dilemma elected officials and the public have to deal with. And I don't know how to solve it, but I think having a forum like this, that we would get together and talk about it, I think is the first start.
That's just a great point. You know, I mentioned this debt load that we're carrying, 1.6 billion. You all are talking about it. $3,500 a resident. That's up $1,100 a resident just since 2003. Troy, should that be a panic-inducing number or not?
No, what I think it does is it's a constraint on future options. We're very highly leveraged. I think this year we've got about 16% of every tax dollar that we collect is going to debt service beyond the enterprise funds.
16%.
16%, so almost 1 in every $5 is going to debt service, which limits our ability to do new options, gives us limited flexibility. But from a budgetary standpoint, I think we have done a fairly good job of managing that debt. We're still somehow, even though we are significantly higher than a lot of our peer cities, we're still a AA credit. One of our fundamental strengths has always been.
Although that's dropped a notch, right?
Well, we've got a negative outlook, but we've been AA for 30 years, and so that's the approach that we're taking. There's a negative outlook on the part of Fitch because of our high debt loads. But one of our strengths of our city has always been a diverse revenue streams. I mentioned the earnings tax, but sales taxes, property tax, and the fact that we have room to grow. Kansas City's great asset is it's 320 square miles. A lot of it's still undeveloped, so there's opportunities for us to grow the tax base. We're not in the same situation that a lot of urban core cities are around the country where they're hemmed in, where the development is occurring in the suburban areas, and it's a battle to do redevelopment. We get the opportunity in Kansas City to have urban growth and as well as a significant suburban growth. So that's a strength. We just have to be very cognizant of our limited choices. We just can't chase every project. The days of us being able to go out and say, we want that, let's incur the debt to have it, are over. We have to put in place a revenue stream to pay for it, or at least pay for the overwhelming majority of that project. So I think, forces some fiscal discipline. I think it'll make us better in the long run. I think it's raised the awareness of the need for a long-term financial plan. It's elevated the concept of reserves. Some of you may remember Kansas City went a lot of years in the 1980s and early 1990s with $1 million in their fund balance in the general fund. Now we are at a little over 8% 1 month's expenditures, and the council set a goal of 2 months' expenditures. That works well from a credit standpoint because they know we're serious, and we make progress every year in building those reserves. It's a tough slog, but this council has recognized that there are limitations to what we can do. We're going to be in this situation probably for the next 10 to 15 years as we work off our debt loads, but it just forces us to make quicker, better decisions, more fully informed decisions, and we don't have the full range of options we may have had 5 to 7 years ago. I think it makes us better stewards of the tax dollars, but it sure isn't as much fun as it used to be.
Yeah.
Jim Gagg, CPA, does this $1.6 billion panic you?
Well, when you look at the increase that's taken place since 2004 or 5, it's a rather dramatic increase in debt service. And the rating agencies have said, we're concerned. Fitch last year, giving a negative outlook. We're hearing those same rumblings in Washington. So yeah, I am concerned about the city maintaining its credit rating, as Troy articulated here, its future borrowing capacity. It's sustainable now, but as he said, which is really the point I was trying to make as well, it reduces the flexibility of the city and the elected officials on the options that they have in the future. And that's really, when you think about how are we competing with other metropolitan areas, why is this an attractive place to live? Why is this an attractive place to do business? What kind of workforce is here? It's really those kinds of investments that the city and the metropolitan area can make that make this attractive. I'll just say a word about the Civic Council, though maybe some of you who are not familiar with it. It's a not-for-profit organization and its membership consists of the CEOs of major companies, not just in Kansas City, Missouri, although many of them are, but from the metropolitan area. And we are very concerned about, I'll use the word partnership, but we are reviewing the progress that the city is making in preparing this long-term financial plan because we're concerned about these issues. And for the metropolitan area, it's really important to have a strong anchor city. Kansas City owns most of the major infrastructure assets for the metropolitan area. It's the home of the sports teams. So there are many compelling reasons why CEOs who are looking about what kind of a business environment do we have here to attract future business and so forth. That's why we're concerned, and that's why they've invested in dedicating their resources to this review. So to me, that's the big picture. I am concerned. The city has done a good job, I think, in managing this debt, but the rate of growth, the credit rating agencies have, the red flag is up.
Jan, I'm wondering, are we, in the last few years, are we increasing our payments to reduce this debt, or are they staying the same?
No,
Are
they're
we
going up.
increasing? What are we doing?
They're going up, but the
They're
debt.
going up and we're paying off more, you're saying?
Right, and it's, what's so interesting, what's so good that the Citizens Association is having a forum like this and talks to candidates. No candidate runs on the platform, I'm going to get the fund balance up to 16%. So we really have to get people who are willing to make those tough decisions. We went from 2% in the fund balance when I first was on the council in 2007 to 8% during a recession. So, that has, I really am proud of the work that we've done and our partnerships with the chamber and the civic council, our labor groups, that have really tried to address these issues in a collaborative manner. So,
Now, Alfred, you have some worldwide perspective here. What should we be concerned about with a debt this size? Is it a pressing issue in your mind, or should we be more laid back about it?
This morning, actually, before I came here, I looked at some data, and I looked at all the financial statements of similar cities, about 14, 15 population between 200,000 to 600,000, et cetera. So these cities include Atlanta, Chicago, Long Beach, Wyandotte County, Arizona, Minneapolis, et cetera. So Kansas City, Missouri, right now, if you actually count all the long-term and short-term obligations, pension liabilities, GO bonds, user charge bonds, et cetera, Kansas City is right in the middle among those 14, 15 cities, about 6,000 per capita debt level. It's not as bad as like Chicago, which is about 10,000 per capita debt level. But it's not as good as, for example, Minneapolis. So I think Kansas City is in the middle, so it's kind of a half empty, half full situation. But I think, the long-term outlook is important. Having that strategic outlook to think about what will happen in the future and what we need to do now, I think is important.
I'm just wondering, again, for some perspective on our spending. I've heard that the budgets for the police and the fire departments in Kansas City, Missouri are something akin to the federal defense budget in terms of what they occupy. Just how much of the budget these days, Jan, do those departments occupy? Give us some sense of that.
I think it's 60%.
69% of the upcoming
69%.
budget.
69%
Of the
operating
general
budget.
fund. Yeah.
The general fund.
And the trend line there, Troy, is going up, or?
Yes, last year it was 63% of the general fund budget. So
5 years from now, where are we going to be with that?
that's one of the issues. I want this financial plan to kind of help us guide that, because that pathway is very reminiscent of the federal government. It's on an unsustainable path, because what you'll get is the crowding out of all the other services, whether it's streets, solid waste, trash collection, neighborhood and community services, all the administrative support functions. I mentioned one of our assets is our size as a city, the developable land. But one of the expectations of our city is the residents at 124th and North Home want the same level of emergency service and the same level of response that one would get at 12th and Oak. And that provides a whole lot more resources. You need significantly more people The last time I checked, police and fire are still fairly labor-intensive functions. And so there isn't an easy way to replace that, either automating those services or providing technology to replace them. So that's one of it's both our strength and it's our liability, and we got to manage both sides of it. But that's one of the issues that we continue to have to wrestle with is public safety as a larger and larger share of a general fund that for the most part is flattening out. Most of our revenues, with the exception of the earnings tax, and we've become much more dependent on the earnings tax as our primary revenue stream. We're seeing sales tax flatten out. I was in a meeting with the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, and we were commiserating long-term growth in the sales taxes is about 1% a year. So it's very tough to support a civilian workforce with expectations of 2 to 3% growth in wages on 1% revenue growth. Property taxes are flat. If it wasn't for Platte and Clay County, property taxes would be declining because you're seeing a shift and the loss of property assessed valuation in Jackson County. Utility taxes are either at risk from a regulatory standpoint or at the direct impact of energy conservation measures. So we've got a lot of revenue side pressures that are squeezing the available resources and expenditure commitments that are consuming it. So it's that it's that balancing act of trying to figure out what's the right level of service delivery within the available resources that we have, and trying not to do one side too much or the other so that you put yourself from a long-term standpoint. Jan mentioned 2.5% fund balance. That was the same year that you may remember that the ambulance service got in trouble, and we had to do significant amount of bailouts in the ambulance because of federal Medicare cutbacks. At one point, I think I reported to the Finance Committee, we were functionally broke. We had expended more than we had available in reserves. We had to cut back in the other parts of the organization to do that. Those are the types of long-term risk we need to manage as an organization, because our margins of exposure, our margins of risk are so great, we just can't afford wild swings in any direction. So again, that's a constraint on our availability of resources, our availability to work off the wish list, and there's a huge wish list in this city, but we're having the right discussion about service delivery versus reserves. I'm a proponent of first you got to have the reserves before you can have a rational conversation about service delivery.
Well, let me see if I have this right. So you're saying, Troy, that we spend 69% of our operating budget on police and fire, and yet if you poll the folks in this audience, I bet they would say most are dissatisfied with the level of service when it comes to police, constantly running from call to call, no time for routine patrol, that kind of thing. Every year you hear the police chief say we need more officers, not fewer officers. The trend's going up. This is frustration inherent, isn't it, Jan?
Our police and fire, the citizen satisfaction survey, they're rated very high. So I know that the paper reports a lot of horrible homicides, but the level of satisfaction, our ambulance service is the most popular service provided by the city. So
Let me ask, is this audience satisfied with the level of police protection, or are you dissatisfied? If you're satisfied, raise your hand. How about dissatisfied? Well, there goes to your point. Yeah. Okay. You
so
win.
we do a good, because
Point well taken.
it depends on what has happened to you or in your neighborhood. If you've had a problem in your neighborhood, you're dissatisfied. If your neighborhood hasn't had an issue, even though we all hear about these horrible things that are happening, we still have a very, very good police department. Chief Forte is doing a great job. He's really targeting resources where they need to. Urban cities, we have a lot of problems.
Hey, Jim, as you look at all this and this conversation, one thought that's gone through my mind in the past is you just wonder if Kansas City, Missouri is too big. Do we have too many square miles when it comes to police and fire protection and everything else? Do we need to think about that aspect of who we are?
Well, that's a challenge, and in some ways has an inherent level of cost. But at the same time, it's an opportunity. There are opportunities to have economic development in those areas and enrich the tax base, grow the population. There are also opportunities to redevelop parts of the urban core and the city today that need to go through a transformation. So it presents, I think, a lot of investment opportunity, and one that a lot of cities would like to have that problem. But it does create a challenge, as Troy has outlined here, in terms of, a city of 320 square miles, it's a real challenge to provide the services.
In just a minute, Alfred's going to talk to us for a few minutes about one of the points of this conversation tonight, which is the need that many feel for long-term financial planning by the City Council. First, though, just one more sort of table-setting question. What aren't we doing as a city? What's on our wish list these days? Things that we need to be doing, but we're not doing because of financial constraints. Are there some very obvious things that sit out there that we're missing, Troy or Jan?
Well, we have a $6 billion deferred infrastructure problem. One of the issues with, again, is our size presents opportunities, but it's also in a very expensive cost. So we have, in years past, that was the easiest way to balance the budget, was to defer infrastructure replacement. Whether it's a $2.5 billion overflow control sewer repair program, over $1 billion in deferred water repairs, about $2 billion in deferred street repairs. One thing we don't have is, what we did was we earmarked resources for a better part of a decade. Unlike a lot of other cities, we don't have a significantly bad bridge infrastructure anymore, because we made the commitment of resources and we earmarked the right resources for a decade, and we fixed our bridges. It took that sustained level of commitment to focus on those issues. But you mentioned pensions. We've got large long-term liabilities, but our big long-term liability, again, is our infrastructure issue, and how do we tackle that in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's affordable, because they haven't, those pipes went in the ground in 1896 in front of this building, and just this summer, they got replaced because they blew themselves right out of the ground. So those are the types of stuff we have deferred for too long. We got rid of our last wooden water pipe in the city market a couple of years ago. So those are the types of infrastructure that have been deferred for far too long in Kansas City. The bill came home 30 years ago. We ignored it. We said, it'll get better. We'll figure out a creative solution to it. There isn't a creative solution. You just got to fix it, and that's expensive, and it's going to get more expensive the longer we defer.
Troy, of the $6 billion you just mentioned, how much of that are sewers? How much of that is streets, curbs, gutters, all that stuff?
It's roughly about a third each. It's about $2 billion in streets, $3 billion in sewers, and the rest is in the water system. So it's roughly about a $2 billion issue on each side, $2 to $3 billion issue on each of those three components. Big system, lots of what I call benign neglect. It wasn't intentional. It was always an issue of trying to figure out another higher priority need or something else, as opposed to fixing that infrastructure. We're not alone. Every other city is having this issue. It's common to the urban core centers throughout the country, but it's one of those issues we're going to just have to address.
We also want to make sure we're investing in things that'll draw new people to Kansas City and young people back to Kansas City. Bike lanes, people love bike lanes, and pedestrian walkability, and they want to live downtown. They want an exciting downtown. So we have to do the basic infrastructure, but we also have to provide what a lot of people think now bike lanes and pedestrian systems are basic infrastructure. So we have to plan for what we have not done in the past, but we have to look to the future to make sure we have a city that's drawing people in.
Alfred, this city has a history of basically going year to year on budgeting. There have been efforts, strenuous efforts of late to change that. Why is long-term financial planning important? Why don't you take it away for a few minutes here and dazzle us with the notion of long-term financial planning?
Well, before I do that, let me actually put this in context. First of all, I think a lot of us focus on debt because of the media, because of the true problem of the federal deficit issue.
It's always the media, isn't it, Alfred? Yeah.
Sorry, Steve. Yeah. Except your morning station show. So, all right. But I think we need to keep in mind several things. First of all, debt is a very legitimate financing tool. I don't know whether you heard story like this, decades ago when there were some Asian immigrants coming to Canada and US or Australia, coming from China, Hong Kong, especially to buy apartments or condos. They say, how much is that house? $300,000. Okay, good. Here's $300,000 cash. I buy it right away. Now, there's one way to finance infrastructure or long-term capital, but seldom we do that. And if you actually think about the reason why we want to use that is because actually a lot of this infrastructure is used by multi-generation users. So you don't want the current generation or current residents to pay for everything. So there are some good reasons why we want to have that. The key questions I think we are all struggling is, first of all, whether that level is too high. So that's the first question. I think we have been focused on that. The second, and I think more important question is what that is for. Is it investing in long-term infrastructure that will attract business, that will attract residents to help them stay here? Or is it that used for current consumption? It's one thing if I ask my wife, hey, I want $500,000, not $500,000, $500. So what do you want to use it for? I want to buy movie tickets to treat my friends to go to a movie. Well, forget about it, right? But I say I want to use $500 to buy a computer for you so that you become more productive in your work. It's for her. Right? She say, maybe she'll think about that, right? So I think what that debt is for is very important. And so from that perspective, that means we need to have a long-term perspective on these things. What are we financing and what are we trying to do? And I think the multi-year long-term strategic perspective, I think is missing in a lot of city planning, city financial management. It's kind of like, that happened to me several weeks ago. Some of us at the university say, oh, it's lunchtime, let's get into the car. Let's hop into the car and I start to drive, right? Drive for 3 minutes. And then all of a sudden I say, where are we going? So I don't know whether that happened to you. And a lot of times it happens to a lot of city planning or the motion of budgeting is that we just year by year, we look at the spending, the revenue, we just go year by year without thinking where we are going. And so I think with that strategic outlook is very important. I think the city here is doing that. I know that they have some long-term strategic view, they have some strategic planning. The key, I think, is how you actually match that with the citizens' version or the citizens' view of the city future. And I think that, again, is missing in a lot of cities. A lot of times it's really not just about how much tax you want to pay. It's actually about what that tax dollar will bring you, what that will buy for you. I actually talked to a lot of citizens. I think the average citizens understand it. I've never heard a person who will come to me and say, you know what, that BMW just sucks. That is just a bad choice. Why don't you buy a Hyundai or Honda Civic? Because it's cheaper, right? They are different things and they give you different values. And I think it's important for citizens to have a dialogue with the community leaders, with business leaders, with the elected officials to talk about what value we want to buy using our tax dollar in the long run, in the long haul. And I think that dialogue should be the beginning of our financial planning. And once we have that dialogue, in the long run, what we want to have in this community, then we could go back and talk about multi-year capital improvement plan, what we need, what kind of infrastructure we need, and then come down to the annual budget to go back and say, okay, if the long run we need that kind of infrastructure, that kind of facilities, that kind of economic development, this year in our annual budget, what we need to do to allocate money to achieve that. And also what kind of communities you want. I think having that kind of civic dialogue with the strategic planning, with the annual budget is the key.
Jan, one sense I get about one benefit of long-term financial planning is that over time, it enables members of the council to keep their eyes more on the horizon, looking out in the distance, as opposed to every year being down in the weeds, right, rebuilding this thing from scratch. Am I seeing that right, or help me there?
And I'm very proud that our council has adopted a strategic plan by ordinance that lists the areas that are our priorities, our strategic areas with specific goals and performance measures. So we have fabulous city management staff that have identified performance measures, and then we're going to use the KC Stat opportunity that the mayor's office is instituted to look at those performance measures. Are we meeting our goals? And then tie those to resources. So the city has really come a long way in developing that strategic plan. Of course, that's only as good as the council's resolve and the mayor's resolve to abide by it. But we are beginning, for the first time, I think, to institutionalize strategic thinking. And so the citizens, I think in the budget, we have our strategic plan with the performance measures, so our citizens will really see where we're going. They can weigh in on whether they think that's a good strategy or not, whether they think maybe there needs to be a little bit of an adjustment, but they certainly have the opportunity to know what we think is the vision.
You know, Alfred, the 50 largest cities in this country, the 30 largest, how many of those cities do these long-term financial plans? Most or not?
Most don't. That's why I think it's a problem. I mean, again, I think the budgeting process is a very mundane, technical, routine exercise. I think a lot of cities lack that strategic long-term vision. Where are we going?
And they don't because it's hard work. I mean, this is a difficult task to commit a council to a long-term vision and then maintain that vision in the years going forward at a time when priorities might be changing.
Well, I think that there are several problems. One is that institutionally, I mean, this is a democracy, right? And so institutionally, when elected officials have a short-term electoral cycle perspective, they need to take care of a lot of short-term needs to prove that they have done something for the citizens. So very seldom, if you go to and talk to any elected officials at the national level even, or state level or local level, seldom they will talk to you, in 10 years, I want to achieve this, right? Actually, what you may have heard from the media, again, is that, you know, the day one when they get elected, then they will say, what do I need to do tomorrow to start to do campaign finance, right? So I think that kind of thing is very important. But I think this is why having the dialogue between business leader, community leaders, and citizens to think about the long-term vision is very important. That goes back to the elected officials. They tell them, we want these kind of things, and we want you to work on it. And so I think having this kind of forum is a good start.
Jim, the Civic Council is concerned and interested in this whole long-term planning idea. Tell us about that.
Well, we started off a project back in the spring. We had meetings with Troy and key members of his staff to really express our concern as well as to get an understanding of what was the city committed to developing a long-term financial plan. And I think we very much got the sense early on that yes, they were. But again, it's the devil's in the details, and we formed a task force comprised of local business leaders, many of them members of the Civic Council or from the member companies, people from other organizations such as the Downtown Council. And we met with Randy Landis, who's over here, the Director of Finance, probably I'd say 10 to 12 times over the course of the summer. We started all this off with a meeting with Councilwoman Markison and Troy and the mayor. Just really to solidify, is the city really committed to this? And we got an expression of support. Yes, we are. We will devote the resources to it. And our charge was we will work with you to facilitate that effort. I think one of the things we recognized early on that this wasn't going to happen in 2012. The work that was accomplished in 2012 was really, I'd say, foundational in nature. It really kind of put in some of the building blocks for what is going to be a multi-year approach to developing, implementing, and then operating within. Those are three distinct phases, and I think the easiest one is developing the plan. Then implementing it, you got 5,000. It's great to talk about this with Randy and Troy and the people that work for them, but you've got 5,000 employees that work in direct service and administration that need to be brought into this process, buy into it, embrace it. So there's going to be a significant effort to really drive this down through the organization.
And then the council has to stick with it.
Absolutely.
That's the challenge.
That's the challenge.
One big challenge here. Yeah.
And as Jan pointed out, this has to transcend mayoral or civic council administration. So this is a framework really for the city to make long-term decisions, because what you're often talking about is if we're going to invest the money for alternative project A, then what gets eliminated? Because there's a limited amount of tax revenues to spend.
some folks here, Troy, might be very concerned about the impact of the very sharp tax cuts in Kansas, and what is that doing on this side of the state line. Talk in Jefferson City about trying to lower our own income taxes here, but what do you see happening so far?
Well, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation going forward. I am kind of beginning to think that we need to take, again, a longer-term view of this issue. Kansas may have made a fundamental change in direction that they won't like the outcome with in a couple of years. Once school budgets start getting cut, transport infrastructure starts to fall apart. One of the amenities I think that we have as a strength in Kansas City is some of the amenities of the city within the park, the Kessler Plan, that 100-year quality of life, the quality of life that we enjoy as Kansas Cityans. I think we need to sell that. We recognize that it may not be as cheap as our neighbors to the west, but we're going to provide a quality environment for us to live, work, and play. And I think we're going to have to take a longer view from a Missouri side versus to watch this Kansas issue. Kansas isn't the state of Texas with oil revenues and natural gas revenues. There's some oil, but I see a whole lot of wind farms. I don't see that being the panacea that Kansas needs to pay the bills long term. But it'll be an interesting debate, and it'll be an interesting conversation. I think Missouri just needs to avoid to try to race to the bottom. If we try to keep up, we may just watch ourselves go down. So. We just need to stand and watch it. There may be components of the Kansas tax policy that are replicable, that make sense. There may be other things that aren't. I'm a big fan of long-term balanced approach to issues, because there's an old budget axiom: what the left hand giveth, the right hand will taketh away. And I think we're going to see that in the next couple of years in Kansas.
Well, Troy,
and I think we just have to be prepared to react where it makes strategic sense for Kansas City, Missouri, and the Missouri.
I was going to say, what if it works? What if it's the greatest thing that's happened in the Midwest since, I don't know, Joan Finney? I don't know. You know?
Then I think we will adapt and react, and hopefully we'll find oil somewhere in them there Ozarks. But I think we'll just have to react. I just don't think we want to be too reactionary. You know, if my dad always told me, you know, if the kid in front of you jumps off the bridge, are you going to watch him jump, or are you going to run right with him? I think there's a rational argument for standing back, see if he sinks or if he swims. And then call for the ambulance or the medical services that we can provide. So I think we just have to take a long-term view of this and not react to the deal or the crisis du jour. And that's what Kansas City has done. A lot of times we've wanted to make sure we didn't pass this golden moment behind, and then we've cut off other options for us. So,
Well, Alfred Ho from the University of Kansas, whose salary is paid for by the taxpayers. I saw you nodding your head vigorously during that exchange. Why?
Well, first of all, I'm really thankful for the audience who hasn't thrown out any tomato and eggs and everything. I would, and then secondly, and I'm an academic, so I could remain neutral, even though my payroll is from the state of Kansas. I could actually back some of Troy's suggestion purely based on academic research. In fact, I actually did a paper with a doctoral student last year on that. What drives investment and economic competitiveness? The major factors based on academic research, economics and political economy, et cetera, are quality of life and recognized brand and a progressive image of the city that help you attract and retain global talents in this globalized economy. Secondly, to retain and also attract business will be infrastructure and good and easy access to key markets, and also having that business-friendly environment. So if you actually listen to all those factors, taxation is a very small piece of that whole list of factors. And so my governor in Kansas decided they're going to focus on one of the many factors on taxation. I think it will be a really interesting experiment to see how that will go. But if you actually trust all the academic research done by these crazy professors. That will be a minor factor. In fact, it will be really interesting, again, for Kansas City, Missouri, and other cities to think about if Kansas, because of lower taxes, as a result, they could not fund education, they could not fund infrastructure, and there are some concerns about poverty issues, and as a result, lead to crime issues. Would that be a really investment-friendly environment for the businesses? So I think that would be something for us to think about, and I think that may also open up a new way of competition. I mean, I think a lot of policymakers think of competition as one dimension. It's really about lower the taxes. But if you actually, again, going back to the literature, going back to the CEO business surveys, they talk about that it's just one smaller factor. They also compete on many other factors. If you have good workers, if you have good quality of life, we will come to your city. When you think about it, if it's all about lower taxes, there will not be Silicon Valley in California. Mm-hmm. So just by that, so you could think about whether taxation is the only driver. But I think for policymakers in Kansas City, Missouri, is to think about, given that environment, how you want to position yourself. And we as academics will be very interested to see it down the road. So we just want to publish papers and do academic research.
Dan Coffin.
Thank you, Steve, and members of the panel. I'd like to ask one last question. How do we make this happen? We didn't get into the details, but Kansas City has started on a long-term financial planning process. And as Troy indicated, it'll take several years to get all the way through to the point where we have an annual process we go through that takes many months, a lot of staff time, but we're going to get there. How do we make it happen? A, it takes money. N'est-ce pas? We've decimated, or not decimated, but significantly reduced staffing in our finance and budget and systems offices. Those are the people that have to crank together all the numbers, the financial analyses, put forth the option of menu of options for the city council. We have to hire staffing, I'm assuming. And most important, how do we maintain the resolve of elected officials, as the councilwoman said, to make this happen? Because everybody here will agree, kumbaya, let's have long-term financial planning. What do we do to make it happen?
Well, you can screen candidates and ask them some of their views about.
We have experience at that.
You have experience about it. I think it'll only happen if we keep working together. I mean, if the Civic Council, Chamber, Labor, the city, outside experts, really, the plan cannot be just the council or the city manager. It has to be the whole community, making sure it's on the table. Okay,
very well. I'd like to introduce, again, Joanne Collins and Alan Dillingham, who will be our co-chairs. They're going to wrap out our final thank yous. If you want information about the Citizens Association, there are blue and white brochures out on a table out there. Please look it over. We'd be glad to have you as part of the organization.
Well, thank you all for being here tonight. We're just delighted that you could join us, and I think this has been a great conversation that we've had here. We've been excited to start these forums up and really appreciate the panelists for being here tonight. Steve also for doing a great job moderating. We didn't do it. I think we mentioned a little earlier, our next one is going to be on April 4th. Am I right on that? We're going to be talking about the control of the police department, since we're now the only city in the country that has not local control, if you want to call it that. But we're going to have that discussion on April 4th. We hope you can join us. We're going to be here at the library again. Really appreciate our partners here at the library for all that they've done to get this scheduled for tonight. We think it's been a great event and hope you can join us again. There is information on our website too, so citizensassociation.com. You can find out about everything we've talked about tonight and the information about the different forums that will be coming shortly. So.
I wanted to say, as a past president of Citizens Association, it's just great to have these forums. We thank you for making that transition. But for Jonathan Kemper, a member of our board of Citizens Association, for Chris Kemper, who runs the libraries in Kansas City, we are really privileged to have this partnership, and we thank you for participating. But I want you to know, as the chair of the Citizens Association, Dan Coffin, he did the lion's share of the work. So let's recognize Dan Coffin. right. And I want to thank this panel. And Professor, you done good. Rock chalk, J-Hawk, hey you.
Thank you.
All done good. Thank you very much, and we appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. And remember, the Citizens Association is a membership organization.